All right. What's up, everybody? I'm Clocks, and today I want to talk about something that's been on my mind for quite a while now. It's something that's been happening in the animation community, and I think it's just a pretty big issue that I don't really see people talking about. Or at least when people do talk about it, most of the time I either see it kind of being pushed off to the side, or I'm the one starting the conversation about it. And then people will talk about it. But otherwise, I feel like these are conversations that I think people within the animation dance community should be having. And yes, I have to specify animation dance, because a lot of people still don't know that it's a style of dance. And I think that's part of the problem, right? Is that people don't know who we are. People don't know what animation is. And it's not just people off the street. It's new dancers, it's veteran dancers. It just seems that the community as a whole doesn't have a clear idea of what animation is. Now, you may say, well, Clocks, everybody knows that the dime stop is the foundation of animation. And I would agree, and I think that's about where everyone's agreements on what animation is end, which is unfortunate, because animation is growing into such a pervasive style, and it's becoming way more visible than it's ever been before. A lot of people are getting into it. A lot of people like what's associated with it, but a lot of people don't realize what it is or where to go to learn more about it, or what parts of the community that are available to access to engage within animation, regardless of whether you live in the States or somewhere in Europe or China. If you are, like, even regionally, each place that I've been to, I was very fortunate to travel a lot for animation this year, and even within parts of the world, like, there are different interpretations of what animation means. And for some people, animation is just vague concepts of looking unreal. For some people, animation is just being a character of any kind. For some people, animation is literally anything that isn't boogaloo within popping. Like, we need to talk. So, realistically, why does this matter, right? Like, why does it matter that we don't have a concise definition? Right? Obviously, we've gotten so far without a definition. Why do we think we need to really sit down and hone this even more? You know, for a while, it did not matter. It really didn't, because it was just a part of popping. You could say whatever substyle you wanted to was a part of popping back when popping was considered an umbrella style. And then basically Pop and Pete came out and said, no, popping is literally just dancing with the hit, and the only, like, even boogaloo is like boogaloo style popping, and it's not actually popping. Correct me if I'm wrong there. I don't know the exact specifics, because I keep looking for the exact post or the exact time when Pop and Pete came out and said this, but it's just kind of one of these, like, underlying rules that people, like, are aware of that happened, but don't really know exactly where. If you know, and I'm just totally missing out, please link it below so I can see it and communicate this further. Because this had a very big impact on where we are today within animation, and within a lot of other substyles. But unlike other substyles that kind of have an idea of who they are, like tutting or waving, right? Animation has a little bit different of a challenge, because animation isn't a what. Animation is a how. Like, we don't necessarily have to agree on what the definition is, or where this definition will take us, but I think just about everyone agrees that animation tends to have more to do with the effects that you bring in some form or capacity the effects that you bring to life within your own movement, right? In that way, you can, if you talk to Bop and Andre and you ask him what's animation, he will clearly say, like, well, anything is animating. You're animating right now. You were animating when you wake up in the morning, right? Like, he'll say that anything is animation. And while I can see that in the context of dance, how that is correct, when you're attempting to teach anybody, when you take up an educational standpoint or you want to be clear and communicative, that phraseology does not help people further grasp the concept of what animation actually is. Yes, you can do just about anything within animation and then quote-unquote animate it to make it look animated, and then it becomes animation, right? So it's not dependent on what we're doing. It just depends on how you do a thing, right? But if you noticed, I had to use the word animation to explain what animation is within the definition. That seems like a problem. And if that, for anyone outside of animation, they'd be like, well, you can't use the word in its own definition. But for people in the animation community, maybe you've heard that multiple times, so maybe it just like whizzed by you and you didn't even like blink at the fact that that is a common experience within the animation community. I want to go into a little bit further about why it matters that we need a definition for animation, basically how it hurts us to not have one, and what I think a solution for that would be, right? Not just a definition, but how to apply it in such a way where we can get people more or less on the same page so we can have the representation that we deserve. Because ultimately it's costing us not just like little nerdy conversations, but it's costing us real jobs because people don't know, like audiences, casting directors don't know what animation is unless they're nerdy enough to go into street dance and really pull this stuff apart themselves, right? It's like maybe some people still know what it is, like some older crowds might, but then you got to balance that concept of like someone who's old enough and someone who was adjacent enough to the community to know what animation has been in the past in order to get a clearer understanding of how it's going to look on screen or on stage or in any position where they're going to hire you for any kind of position or big job, potentially, right? And even if you're not looking to be a professional dancer, right? Like, new dancers benefit from understanding the definitions of animation within animation because they'll learn faster. So I want to order this in a way where it's going to make sense. And so if you've made it this far, you're probably the target audience. So buckle up. We're gonna sit here for a minute. But let me break it down in the most concise way that I know I can. One, explaining that we just talked about how we didn't used to need a definition. So needing a definition is still relatively new. There's another reason why we would need a definition, and we're getting to the point where there are multiple organizations, multiple communities who are throwing bigger animation events, animation-focused events, specifically animation, not just popping, but specifically animation, and animation categories being thrown at larger events, which means we need to know what actually counts as animation and what does not. And we need to more or less understand the rules of the game if we're expecting people to pay thousands of dollars to fly around the world to enter in these wiggling competitions, right? Because you know I love a good wiggling competition, but it just sucks to see somebody put all that effort in and watch somebody not be recognized off of a technicality. Like, that shouldn't happen. And it has. And I've seen it. So let's see if we can do something about it. There's also been resistance to the idea. It's not just been this idea of like, well, okay, now animation is no longer popping, it's going to be its own separate, all the other substyles are now their own separate things. All right, great. So what are we doing with animation, and why haven't we figured this out yet? Why am I seemingly the first person to talk about this? Like, publicly, like, not on a forum, like, actually try to solve this. Like, I've looked back at forums in the past, and there are Reddit posts from 10 years ago of people being like, what is animation? Animation is this, and animation is that. And no one took it any further? Like, they just threw ideas into the pot and then decided not to cook anything or serve it to the rest of the community. It's like, we almost got there. So, why is there resistance to that? Part of it is because we didn't really see any big movers and shakers within the animation community use any of those ideas, right? And anytime they explained animation, they did so in a way that was really lengthy. It took a long time, or it was incredibly vague. Those are the two kinds of answers when you ask people what animation is. Those are the kinds of answers that I got when I asked what animation was. Before I go further with this story, I would like to point out that in representing other people, I am going to do my absolute best to remember things the way they said them with the intention they said them. So even if I don't get the words totally correct, I'm going to do my very best to channel the intention behind the words. I'm not here to bash on anybody. I want to represent people's opinions as they have expressed them publicly, to the best of my capacity. If I misinterpreted somebody's message, feel free to correct me. I'm totally open to that. Based on that premise, that little disclaimer, right? I'm going to go on and basically explain what I've heard other people say about animation. This year at Unimate 2024, which is a robot animation event that Yaya throws in Los Angeles. This is her second year throwing it. She basically had a panel where she put all the faculty on this panel to do a Q&A. If I remember correctly, the panel was Chibi, Slim Boogie, Robozilla, D-Soul. Oh my God! I knew there's more people. There's more people for sure. Why am I? But these were qualified people who have done things in the animation community and have made a name for themselves within animation. Incredible dancers, and they have spent years in the game doing this stuff. Amazing. Clearly a qualified panel to speak on animation. And one of the things that I hadn't heard anybody ask was, what is animation? And the answers I kind of got were a little bit vague. I started getting some of those answers that were closer to like, well, it's being unreal, or it's bringing a character to life. Why do I say that's vague? Because to me, bringing a character to life is already a thing, and it's called acting, right? Like, to me, it's hard to accept any definition of animation that doesn't include whether or not it is a dance, that doesn't include what kind of technique it's used to separate itself from any other dance style, what makes it unique, right? It didn't delineate those kinds of factors to me enough so that when I heard their definitions of animation, or at least what they believed animation to be, it didn't ring. It didn't ring like in a satisfying way, where it's like, yes, I hear what you're saying, and that sounds exactly like all the animation that I know, that I've ever seen, right? But it was just really, really vague. And I've heard other animators before saying, well, animation is just being unreal. Do you know how many things are unreal? Air flares are unreal. Is that animation? Bone breaking is unreal. Is that animation? Like, if you legitimately believe that air flares are unreal, then go ahead and use the definition that animation is just being unreal. But if you don't agree with that, then I think we have to step away from this idea of suggesting that somehow looking unreal is enough to qualify the definition of animation, because it's not. That being said, Slim offered a perspective of his where he said, he actually came forward and spoke about the idea of actually resisting a definition to animation. His point was that he doesn't want to codify it in a way because because there's so much freedom within animation that he doesn't want to lose it. He believes that we will lose the freedom of animation if we if we codify it, if we bring it into a cohesive definition. And there's history associated with that, and we've seen things both in popping and in locking of the styles. Once they become more specific about what they are, they do kind of focus on those elements. So yes, I see what Slim is saying in that regard, and I do think that what has happened to popping, and from what I hear from the locking community, what has happened to locking is, unfortunate in those regards, as far as like trying to push the boundaries in those fields becomes increasingly more difficult. Whereas it seems like animation is like the one place where it's like it's designed to push boundaries, right? Like we want to be able to push this. My immediate reaction to that, I guess, was I see where he's coming from, but I feel like that's still coming from a place of insecurity more than coming from a place of actually teaching. And I think the issues of what's happening to popping and what's happened to locking, as far as like becoming so confined to their ideas that like literally if you don't wear the big pizza hat and the suspenders and the stripes, that no one's going to take you seriously, right? And not that there haven't been lockers who have been able to break those molds, but some of them are literally the best of the best who are doing that, right? It's like you have to be the best in order to be legitimized as a locker who doesn't do that kind of stuff. And a lot of lockers that I do know feel very pressured to dress and act the way a locker would, right? And there's a lot of similar things with popping, right? Talking with my friends in Europe about how tutting in a popping battle will get you laughed at. And to me, as someone in the U.S., like that's crazy to me, right? It's like, because to me it's just like, well, as long as you're hitting with it, that should be enough. If you know how to do both things, then like, yes, hit with the thing, but it shouldn't necessarily matter what else you're doing with it. It's like it's become so streamlined to become this one thing and one thing only. And I think a lot of that stems from codifying something based on technique, not based on principle. Because if you suggest that popping is literally just the tension and relaxation of the muscle on the beat and effectively dancing with that, right? Then you are not just limiting it based on, it's not necessarily limited based on principle, it's limited based on a technique. And anything that's not that technique is excluded from that concept, from the idea of what popping is, which I believe is what has happened to popping. And I think animation is in such a unique space where we don't have to codify based on technique. We can codify based on principles, because there's underlying ideas that inform a lot of the techniques that we use, and we can get to those later. But I think that's the angle that I'm taking, is I believe that there's a way to do all of this without undermining the freedom that Slim talks about, right? Multiple people have shared similar things to this, but effectively a lot of people don't have clear or at least consistent definitions across the board. It's almost like you have to talk to every single animator and everyone's going to give you a slightly different definition. And so now that we're kind of in this place, I think it's important to see the other side of that, right? Like, I think maybe the people who say these definitions don't know how it negatively affects the culture as a whole, or maybe they haven't put it together. So I'd like to present that right now, because we need to know why it matters before we actually care about implementing any solutions to the problem. So here's why it matters. Not having a definition obviously hurts new dancers. When new dancers come into play and they look at something that you do and they're like, whoa, that's cool, I want to do that. Like, regardless of whether they want to do it professionally or anything, for whatever reason, if somebody wants to learn animation, if somebody comes up to us and asks, hey, that's cool, what is that? And we have to give them like a 30-minute explanation on what animation is or isn't, or somehow like we give them an explanation and then they go somewhere else to like try to learn animation and they're getting conflicting information without understanding why. There's no like, it just puts more obstacles, more challenges in the way for new animators to learn animation. Like, the good thing is that people who tend to be interested in animation tend to be nerdy people, so sometimes that stuff doesn't bother them that much. But you can see how easy it is to join to take a breaking class as a complete beginner, and someone's just like, hey, what's breaking? Can you teach me how to break? And they're like, here's the steps, here's the music. And you're like, wow, great. If you go to house, it's like, can you teach me house? And like, here's some steps, here's the music. And it's like, wow, great. Locking, the same thing. You want to learn locking? Here's some steps, here's the music. Great. What do we say to animators who want to learn how to animate? Good luck, right? Because we don't have steps, and we don't have a codified music platform, and that's a whole nother topic. I don't want to get into that now. I'll probably do that in a whole separate video, but that's an interesting discussion to have. And so you can see how those become challenges for new animators. Not having a clear definition also hurts people who've been in the game. I was at Paris Animation Week 2024 in May, and it was an amazing event. Blondie and Bots Kingdom did a really great job. While I was there, I got to meet Ricky from Okinawa. And so he's one of my favorite animators, huge inspiration, and I watched him in one particular battle. I think it was in the robot category. And he was doing like a crazy set early on, and then like partway through just started like popping in the middle of the set. And I was like, oh no. Like why did he just switch to popping in the middle of this? And it was a very curious experience watching someone who I consider to be one of the best in the world lose focus on what the task at hand was, right? If it's a robot battle, we usually want to stick within the robot rules, right? But I think he ended up losing effectively on that technicality, and I don't remember who exactly he lost to, but it was one of those scenarios where I felt like he had every possible opportunity to win that, and it has nothing to do with his ability to dance or his ability to showcase technique, because he's brilliant at that. In that moment, he lost because he didn't clearly understand the rules of the game, which is unthinkable. That was one of the best in the world doesn't even know the rules of the game. That's not a fault of his. That's the fact that someone like him is not clear on the difference between robot and animation and popping, or in those fields, right? Seems to be that is a cultural misgiving, right? That does not have anything to do with Ricky's ability to dance whatsoever. And it just makes me think of if it's happening to him, is it happening to other people? And I started thinking, and I was like, oh my God, Jrock versus Fikshun. So Jrock versus Fikshun was, for people who don't remember or weren't in the scene yet, was effectively this battle that came up as a result of a circumstance that occurred in 2018, I believe, at Highlight the Style. Highlight the Style was another project of Yaya's. I believe it was Yaya and Marie Poppins who came together to throw that. And so that was also in Los Angeles. And they had an animation tournament, and Flat Top was judging. And Fikshun enters this battle, he enters the prelims, and does not make it through prelims. And because of this, he ends up calling out Flat Top. Like, I can see why, right? There are these concepts that don't seem to be clear, right? We're not super clear or focused on what animation is. Therefore, someone who perceives themselves to be an animator enters an animation contest and does not make it through. And that seems like a fair concept of being like, hey, what gives? Like, am I not animating enough for you? Like, where is that line, right? It was a perfect opportunity to discuss what animation was. But that's not what happened. As basically Jrock eventually heard about what happened, calling out Flat Top, and Flat Top basically kind of like took a back seat at that moment, and then it just became Jrock calling out Fikshun for having the audacity to call out an OG like Flat Top. And so at that point, it was like, okay, maybe, like I was thinking maybe they could still, Jrock and Fikshun are, to me, at that time, right, were two sides of like different interpretations of animation. Like, this could be a historical moment where we finally get to figure out what we're doing with animation, right? And the day comes, and the battle is... I'm just going to link the battle below. You can watch it if you want. The battle ended up being more ego-centered than about the original discussion, which was what actually is animation. We had a beautiful moment to explain to the world. We had two high-skilled professionals that had a beautiful moment potentially to explain to the world what they could do, or what animation is, what they could do with animation, to explain what animation actually is. And we didn't get that. But we got a lot of memes. We got those.
Jrock here. It's time for a lesson on the culture of the history. I knew, hater, that it was just gonna... I'm an artist, If you knew anything about culture, you would know that Fikshun is not Slim Boogie. Speaking of history, what do you know about chopping it up with OG?
Those are two veteran animators who should be able to have this conversation, who were not able to have this conversation. Maybe for different reasons than previously stated, but again, we're showing how even at the highest levels of animation, we are hurting ourselves by not really understanding or collectively agreeing in some form or capacity, right? I'm not saying we all have to agree on every single term, but we should agree a little bit more than just animation is just looking unreal, right? It would benefit the entire community as a whole to understand more of what animation is. And we can see that by knowing how it negatively affects the community as a whole. When we're talking about jobs for dancers, people who can pay entertainers big money, like sufficient money to perform, and a lot of them don't know what the term animation is, right? Like, because we don't know what the term animation is, and we just say, oh, it's animation. But then when everything is animation, is anything animation? We have such a diluted concept of what animation is that I feel like it negatively impacts our ability to represent what animation can be, or what at least the unifying forms, the unifying aspects of animation can be. And I think we saw this in a big way if you remember dubstep dancing. We had an opportunity to really codify to really figure out what animation was and what it meant to us. When we saw the rise of Dragon House on So You Think You Can Dance, we saw a major broadcasting corporation like Fox give the microphone to Dragon House members, and they said, "What style are you doing?" And they said, "Animation." For the first time, that's where a lot of people's first and only experience of like big time animation comes from, right? Of hearing the term and being able to associate it with an image. Now, Dragon House included a lot of different styles within their animation. They mixed a lot of different things, and I think if you ask them what their definitions or perspectives on animation are, you might get different things from different people, from different members. But from the broadcasting perspective, So You Think You Can Dance basically looked at that, said, okay, top notch, basically, yeah, it was like Blueprint and Glitch and Top Notch and like a couple others, right? And they were like, that's animation. And it included like tutting and waving and gliding and like all these other things in with animation. All of those elements started becoming recognized with animation. And this is around the time dubstep started, or was already popular, right? At this point, at least in the United States. Or at least the version of dubstep that the US like eventually fell in love with. There was this big push by people who didn't get to hear that, who didn't get to see that connection between like Dragon House and animation and dubstep, right? And so you saw a lot of young kids come out and basically say like, oh, I want to dance to dubstep, therefore I'm a dubstep dancer. Now, the popping community heard about this and basically was like, y'all are just doing popping to dubstep, which is fine, like, you're just not a new thing, you're just dancing popping to dubstep. And some people got more heated about this than others. Some people like really took to like trying to shame them out of it, and some people cared less about it. It was kind of up in the air. But overall, it was a situation that was, one, it became a double standard, and two, it really was just the kinds of people who would be interested in animation, the culture, like it could have spawned a whole subsection of the culture, and it did to an extent, those who stayed, but it could have been way more effective if animation was codified earlier so that we can actually present animation to them, to the people who were calling themselves dubstep dancers, right? Because this is what happened instead. The poppers called out the dubsteppers, or the dubstep people calling themselves dubstep dancers, and said, you're not popping, we're popping, right? Like, you're not dubstep dancers, you're poppers, right? You're one of us. And basically dubstep dancers were like, okay. So they went to popping events, entered, and got laughed out of the room. Because then the popping judges were like, well, that's not popping, get out. And like other people were like, what are you doing? And like there was none of the music that they felt like they wanted to dance to, so they didn't connect, right? And it was just this weird double standard that the popping community insisted placing on dubstep dancers. By saying like, oh, when you can't be your own thing because you're us, but also you're not us, and you can't be us unless you do exactly what we do. And so like, that like double standard really irked a lot of people at the time. And if we knew what animation was, if we knew it's like, oh no, you just fit closer to these people over here, we could have turned the dubstep dancer era into a boom for animation. And we missed. We missed out huge because egos got involved and we didn't really have the understanding to stand up for ourselves. Or to be able to welcome the people that the popping community was pushing away. And that's how it hurts the community. So what do we do, right? We've seen how it hurts the community. We've seen how it hurts veteran dancers. We've seen how it hurts newbies. All right, Clocks, what is it? What is the definition of animation, right? And I think before I give my definition of animation, I want to give a preface to it because I think it's important to understand things from a perspective that's flexible. I'm not necessarily advocating that we say that animation is this and only this. I prefer instead to express that animation is multiple schools of thought. And so I've been in the animation game for a while. I've been dancing for like 15 years-ish. And, you know, I've been dancing around the world with animation, teaching. Like, it's one of my favorite things, and I love it. And I still think it's really, like, there are definitely people who are very qualified to say the things that I'm saying. But they're not. And I don't think they will. I think once I say something, they might. Because boy, oh boy, once you post something on the internet, do people love to talk about it later, right? And so that's effectively what I'm doing, is I want to use this as a jumping off point for people to talk about what they believe animation is and what they want to see within this style, particularly if it means something to them. With that being said, I want a functional definition that is concise and that focuses on the principle, because as we said earlier, when we just focus on techniques, it can lock a style into place, like what happened with locking, like what's kind of happening with popping right now. And we don't want to do that. We want to allow animation to have its freedom. So how do we do all of this at once? First, I want to reiterate that what do we know for a fact is the fundamental underlying principle of animation. One, it is a how, not a what. And in case I didn't explain that enough earlier, it's this idea that, like Bob and Andre said, anything can be animation, it's just how you do it, right? So in that sense, we got to focus more on the how than what actual steps we're doing, because that doesn't seem as important. Are there steps and things that we can use in animation? Yes, but they're not fundamental, they're not foundational to the concept and understanding of what animation is. Two, it is a dance. I believe it is. I've always seen it that way. I think animation is a dance style, so dance has to be part of the definition. We need that to be in the definition somewhere. We know that it's illusionary, but what kind of illusion? There's so many different illusions. We can't just leave that animation is an illusionary dance form, because waving is an illusionary dance form. And so is bone breaking. And also air flares are illusions, right? They look crazy, they look unreal. So it's like those things don't really mesh well with that. And then finally, we need a definition that when tested, when you apply another style, once it is tested, it does not crack. The definition itself doesn't break. With all that said, here's my definition as I've come to understand it based on today. That's what, September 2024? Sure, yeah. September 2024. This is my definition of animation as I understand it. Animation. It's how you dance with the illusion of time. How you dance with the illusion of time. We have the how statement, that is a how, not a what. It is a dance. It showcases the illusion, but not just that illusion. It specifies that the illusion is based on time. Why do I say the illusion is based on time? Well, what's the fundamental principle that just about everybody agrees on is the foundation of animation? The dime stop. And what is the dime stop? The ability to stop on a dime. Yay, right? Effectively, it's crazy. It's supposed to be a cool way to stop because it looks strange. It looks like it breaks the laws of physics. But not just any physics, right? It's not breaking gravity. Like the dime stop doesn't focus on trying to make it look like it's breaking gravity. It's breaking some other form of how we see and perceive the world, right? And since a lot of additional techniques within animation are fundamentally based on time, like fast forward, reverse, frame by frame, slow motion, right? These are all concepts that I would say I feel very confident that a majority of us would agree that all of those things are animation. Even something like vibration. People who started vibrating or started using that, right? Some of them may have seen it as like electricity just coming through them, but some of them were inspired by Ray Harryhausen films. Claymation, these combinations of claymation and IRL, real life live action, claymation and live action mergers, these kinds of stories that were popular at one point in American cinema, and the way certain characters would move, it was a trip to just see something moving in a way that was like vibrating-ish, or like Sinbadding, right? Like, why is it called Sinbad? Why is it called Sinbadding? Right? That's a direct reference to a Ray Harryhausen films. It seems that just about every technique that's fundamental in teaching and explaining what animation actually is related to the illusion of time. Before you all say, well, clocks, what about this? What about this? Great. I hope people are already having those kinds of ideas, those kinds of thoughts. Character, right? I said nothing about character. Well, why? Why is that? Because to me, character obviously is good. Character makes a good animator great. But if you had a battle with two people, if you had a battle, one person versus the other, and one person only had techniques with the illusion of time and had no character, and one person had only character and had no technique, who would you vote for in a battle? I know who I would vote for, and that's why I believe that the foundation of animation is based on the techniques that are in the illusion of time. But there are some people who are like, well, the character is what it's all about. If you genuinely believe that is true for you, then that's why I recommend animation should popularize. I think it would be in animation's best interest to popularize different schools of thought within animation, because just suggesting that we don't mention anything about animation and don't collectively like come to an understanding of the different perspectives within it clearly hurts us in a lot more ways than it helps us. Right? Whatever freedom we have literally only helps the people who are already at the top of the game, right? And even once you're at the top of the game, you can still be hurt by it, right? As in the case of Ricky or anybody else who like just has a different definition of what animation is without expressing it clearly before the battle begins. No animation battle in my history of going to animation battles has ever done. Not a single battle has ever started being like, this is the animation category, we're looking for this and this and this. Why? Out of every other dance style, that's the one that needs it the most, right? Like, we already see, there's enough whacking teachers, there's enough breaking teachers, there's enough popping teachers, right? Right now, animation is in a really prime state to become very big, potentially worldwide. Dance Vision, a huge battle in China, just had an animation category, so we're going to get an influx of people on the Eastern Hemisphere to push and actually like train for that potentially based on the competitive circuit. Meanwhile, Paris Animation Week was a success, and we'll likely see further iterations, and also Unimate. Like, all three of those events are just beginning, right? And that's not even to mention what's happened with Back to the Future battle. From my experience with Back to the Future, they did the battle the best, but also it was in Russian, and so I couldn't really understand a lot of what was said. So there may have been some things, and I have my own thoughts about that battle as well. But so far, I think Back to the Future battle has done animation the best. I think just to wrap up that idea that I had earlier about if you genuinely vote for the character person in the battle against someone with technique, right? Like, then yeah, that would be the equivalent of figuring out what the definition of animation is that's character-based, right? And then we could suggest that, okay, this person or this judge or this battle or this cipher or whatever we're doing, right, we're going to be focusing on character-based animation. And so people can kind of like switch their mind to being like, okay, I'm going to do these kinds of things now, right, as opposed to just leaving it up in the air. Again, to me, the character is simply, it's already acting. If there's no technique, it's just acting. Like, the thing that made animation characters special was the technique. That's why when you ask what are some classic animation characters and they pull out the skeleton, right? It's like, what made the skeleton special? It's not a skeleton that just moves like a skeleton. It's a skeleton that directly references Ray Harryhausen films, right? The claymation, the frame rate, the illusion of time is what made that character that character. Now, I'm not suggesting that my view is correct. I'm just suggesting that this is why I believe what I believe. I've researched this quite a bit, and just looked at a lot of different things that have like come together to figure out why things are the way things are in the animation community. Ultimately, I do think this is something that we need to talk about. I don't think this is something that's going to be solved in like one YouTube video, but I do think this is something that I feel very called to do, and ultimately I want to know what people think. I want to know what you think. If you've made it to the end of this video, if you've made it here, you are probably the target audience. So aside from leaving a like and or subscribe, I do want to hear your thoughts on like what you think animation actually is. What is your definition of animation, and can you break it, right? I used to have a definition of animation that was very simple, very similar to what I had today, but it was based around the illusion of motion. And that's how I defined it, was a dance style where you play with the illusion of motion. And in that way, I was talking with Bebotics, and he said, well, bone breaking is an illusion of motion. And I had to stop because he got me. And I was like, yep, you're 100% correct. So how can I be more specific about the principle we're using within animation? Again, I don't want to specify the technique. I want to specify the principle, because as long as we specify the principle, we can invent new techniques within animation and add them to what animation is, right? All of a sudden, NPC has a style of animation, right? Which in and of itself is not animation, but when you animate with it, it becomes a style of animation, right? It's becoming synonymous with a very specific perspective, right? It's a character that I apply, and when I animate it, when I apply these timing effects to the character, it makes that character come alive in a different way. And so that's just another example of techniques that like arise, concepts that arise maybe in the culture. In like maybe in a couple years we'll see the rise of another new technique, or maybe I'm overshooting that. Maybe in like 2 weeks we'll see someone come up with like a new concept, and it'll be all the rage for a while. I think there should be space for that. I think Slim is right that we need to champion the freedom of animation. But I also think that without having a definition, we are hurting ourselves in more ways than it's worth. We are worth it. Like, as a community, we do exist. We're not just some niche, right? Like, I know as animators, like, you tend to be pretty nerdy people, like, definitely myself included. And so one of the things that comes along with that territory is that nerdy people tend to not stand up for themselves or be too vocal about their beliefs. It would be helpful for us to get over that. We don't all have to agree on specifically the terms and conditions, but I do think that there is room to codify a few specific schools of thought within animation, and what those schools of thought should be are up to the consensus, right? I think I have a definition that squarely fits within the concept of something like a technique school of thought. Again, some others might suggest a character school of thought, and yet others might suggest that animation is based on electrofunk, right? The electrofunk era of popping and animation, right? And pull all their information, all of their concepts and understanding from that experience of animation, right? And there could be way more that I don't know about. But the point is, these are conversations we should be having. I want to hear your thoughts. Go ahead and post down below if you agree. Also post down below if you disagree, right? Like, point out certain things I may not have thought about. But otherwise, thank you all very much for your time, for watching. I appreciate every single one of you. And I am very much looking forward to a more unified, cohesive, and self-acknowledging community. So, thank you so much, and hope to see you around.